Hi, my name is Talia. Welcome to Talia Nerds Out. I'm well aware I don't look anywhere near my best today, but that is, in fact, kind of the point. We're coming on towards the end of June, which I mentioned toward the end of May and early in June, that June has recently been declared to be Mast Cell Awareness Month. So it deals with mast cell conditions such as mastocytosis and one of the medical conditions that I have, mast cell activation syndrome. And that is what I am here to discuss today, is mast cell activation syndrome, plus a book haul related to that. Now, how does that relate to why I made a video knowing that I do not look my best? First of all, if you are unfamiliar with mast cell, basically mast cells themselves are white blood cells. They're very important when it comes to dealing with the body's way of dealing with infection, with allergies, that kind of thing. And then when you see the mast cells go wrong, you can see different things. It can show the way it's acting up in many different ways in the body. Mast cell activation syndrome specifically is not uncommonly seen with dysautonomia, particularly POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which is one of my medical conditions, but is also often seen with hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. They're considered a trifecta. But, excuse me, there are different triggers for a flare-up of mast cell. We've had some really high temperatures here in Virginia, plus we've also had a lot of thunderstorms this whole month. But this week in particular, we had a lot of high heats. So something that occurred starting on Sunday is I started noticing some breakouts of the skin. So my body, that was mast cell kind of like showing its irritation being there, and one right here that has caused some lymph node enlargements. Just my body letting me know that it's angry and the mast cells just overreacting to barometric changes in the heat, and then going with the barometric changes, the thunderstorms that we've been having. You might actually hear at some point thunder in the background because we are currently having a thunderstorm, or at least moments before I started this video, we were having a thunderstorm. So one of the other things that for me occur when I'm having a flare is I will get temperature fluctuations, which can have something to do with the dysautonomia as well as the mast cell. I can get overstimulated. I think I've mentioned hot temperature fluctuations, so hot flashes, cold flashes, chills, etc. And it can also affect my mood, can make me particularly emotional. And so that kind of leads into, and it's going to make sense when I go into it more, but it's going to lead into these books that I picked up. So I ended up, because I know that with mast cell, I am on several antihistamines to kind of try to calm down the body's overreacting with the mast cells as if random things are allergens. And I mentioned already weather, temperature, emotions, stress, all that other sort of thing. For me, also even a lot of social interaction. So I can be very limited to anywhere from if I'm having a particularly bad day, 2 to 3 hours might be the most I can spend out. Sometimes even that's too much for me to spend out of my room during the day. It just all depends on the kind of day that I'm having. But I ended up picking up, because I've known for a while, if I'm on antihistamines, I should probably look into a diet that decreases the histamine. So I picked up a couple, and actually the authors involved with both of these not only have mast cell activation syndrome themselves, they are, I think both of them are functional medical doctors, and they both have had some sort of connection with Dr. Afrin, who wrote the book that I mentioned at the beginning of the month, or at the end of May, about mast cell activation syndrome, called, I don't have it with me, something about the CAM, I can't remember. If I'll try to put it up here because I don't feel like to get it. But it was written by Dr. Afrin. It's basically case studies, and he goes into figuring out what mast cell is, different testing processes, etc. But he was very influential in trying to figure out stuff with mast cell, and these authors are either a familiar with their work, with his work. I believe that's what happened here. And this author is apparently, or at least one of these authors have apparently co-authored something with Dr. Afrin in the past. So both of these books do go into the science of his antihistamine diet, why that works, what foods are particularly high in histamine, what ones increase the release of histamine, and they cover it in slightly different ways. I think this one also focuses as well on migraines, eczema, vertigo. It's not purely mast cell. This one has a lot more of a focus on mast cell in particular. After it goes into the science, it then goes into the recipes. Now, maybe during a week where I was already having weather to deal with and already flaring a lot, maybe looking at huge lifestyle changes was a bit much for me, because a lot of times when they have you try to figure out what foods you react to, and I already know some of the foods that I react to just because I had noticed a burning in my mouth with these particular foods, or other symptoms with these particular foods. So I've already known I need to keep those lower. Tomatoes can affect me. So can strawberries definitely affect me, especially if they're sitting at any length of time in the fridge and allowed to build up the histamines even more. And if I don't properly, certain kinds of applesauce can affect me. I'm pretty much stuck with one brand. But where both these books look like they're good in running through the science of things and providing recipes, if you're not in a really good brain space, it can be very overwhelming, because all you see is basically this huge list of don'ts, and then the fact that you have to go down to a very small amount and then slowly add different foods on. It can be very overwhelming, particularly if you're like me and the mixture of different medical conditions limit the amount of time that, not only the amount of time that you're able to spend out, but also the level of activity, how much it fatigues you. And if I'm at the stove too long, the heat can cause me to feel unwell. Also, standing too long can cause both my feet and my legs along the shins to hurt, making it so I can be knocked out for a couple of days if I have a day where I'm trying to maybe prep ahead of time and have a couple of meals frozen. And cooking every day isn't always an option for me energy-wise. So for me, this probably wasn't best for me to peruse either of these books, and go thinking about it too much when I was already going through a flare. It does look like both of these books are very good. They walk you through the process. Like I said, they go through triggers and how to figure out your triggers, and not just food, but like other triggers as well. Although the focus is going to be on food. They mentioned some of the symptoms that you might expect to see. And also things that might be commonly seen, that might either be seen commonly with mast cell activation, or where there's a correlation with high histamine levels. And they mentioned things like fibromyalgia. You might see high histamine being an issue. But they mentioned some of the symptoms, and these are things that I have experienced in the past: headaches, migraines, poor concentration or memory, nerve pain, nerve numbness or tingling, flushing, hives, rashes, heart palpitations, although I've got POTS as well. Pain, twitches, hypermobility. Now, I'm going to actually, over the weekend, I did, and not this weekend, and probably the weekend before, I had the twitches that they describe, not just the little bit of tremors that I do get, and I've had that show up on camera before, but full on torso, arms, upper legs, spasms. And we were having, as soon as we had our thunderstorm happen, so about 2 hours after they started, they stopped. But it was incredibly uncomfortable, made it hard to stand, made it hard to walk. Oh, and my jaw as well, so it made it hard for me to talk and eat. And I ended up having, because I had abdominal muscle spasms as well, I ended up having sore muscles in my abdomen for several days. And I personally think that that was set off by the weather, which could be a mixture of the mast cell setting things off and combining that with the fact that I have got Ehlers-Danlos as well, which is just, I don't have the same support, for lack of a better term, physically, where, you know, things are more stretchy, so it's more likely that the muscles are going to be maybe a bit overstressed more easily. Some of the other things mentioned for mast cell are sleep problems, sensitivity to smells, light, sounds, temperature. They also mentioned electromagnetic fields, so like using a lot of tech, that kind of thing. And I definitely do have a sensitivity to smells, light, sounds, and temperature. Food allergies and sensitivities, etc., etc. And each of the books have different levels of pictures to help. So most common causes. I think that this one's probably the one that is most colorful. So a lot of pretty pictures for the recipes, a lot of pretty little graph type things like there. This one, whereas it does have pictures, but I don't think they're quite as pretty to the same extent as the other book. But what I like about this book is it'll tell you what foods are, okay, stage 1. You're very much in the early stages of ruling things out. Stage 2 recipes, stage 3 recipes. Not everyone might be able to get to the point where they could add stage 3 foods back in their diet. I haven't done more than briefly peruse. Like I said, I got overwhelmed. I got overstimulated. It actually caused a cascade of symptoms for me where I ended up getting emotional. And actually, because I did get emotional, you'll notice that I've got swelling here now, where this side is fine. I already had a bit of an infection developing here because of a skin breakout, and all it's healing over. But because this area was already affected, I've now got swelling here. And that is my body reacting to the mast cell overreaction. So hence, this is why actually I had no intention of recording until some of these symptoms eased up, because I have finished like Red River. I have other book hauls, but I don't like getting on camera when I am having a bad stretch. But I realized I hadn't done much in the way of, sorry, if I can see now that it's more swollen, but it's been feeling swollen around here for a while, even though this is the first time it's gotten to the level of swollen that it is, because like I said, I got triggered to a more emotional reaction because I got overstimulated by overwhelming myself, and that cascaded into causing a swelling reaction from the emotion. So the swelling I already had on this side of the face is even more than it has been. So this eye feels a bit sore, and it's also increasing some of the fatigue that I've had. But yeah, I think that both of these books are very good in addressing the science behind things. I do look forward to going more into them. It's not going to be right away. I don't think that I'm in a good space symptom-wise where I can handle it. And I know myself that I have to make sure that I don't get myself emotionally worked up, because then not only can you not think when you're emotionally worked up, I can, as we've seen here, or as I mentioned here, cause a cascade of symptoms, which then can even knock me out for a while. I'm having heat flashes right now too. But I'm also chilled, so if I take off these layers, I'm gonna need to put them right back on. So, where was I going with that? So yeah, well, I'm well aware that I have to keep my emotions at a good level, at homeostasis. I also know that I can't just avoid an issue because I find it to be overwhelming. So it can make that balancing act a bit difficult, because it's going to, one of the biggest things I noticed when I was working in the hospitals, when you would have, like if you're dealing with your diabetic patients, the hardest thing for them was lifestyle change. And that's in general the hardest thing for most people when you're trying to deal with chronic issues. It's a lot easier to throw medication at something, and while medication can help, there's usually a certain point where you need to do some sort of lifestyle change as well. And your energy levels can make those lifestyle changes very hard. If you feel like you're losing a lot, as in if you're losing a lot of food, if you're losing a lot of activities that you used to enjoy, if you just feel like there's more loss than gain, that can be overwhelming. So there's a lot that can go into the difficulty of lifestyle change. And it can be very easy to say, well, especially if you're not someone who has a chronic issue, well, why don't you just do X? That should be simple, you know? But a lot of times you might not have the mental bandwidth to handle that, even making the plans at that point. You might need a little bit of extra support, or you just might need to get to the point where I tackle this one thing now and then go from there. Because that's usually when I would get a bit overwhelmed working in the hospital, because I worked cardiac telemetry, then I worked med surg, and then I worked ICU in a small hospital ICU. But the one thing that I always noticed in those situations is when things are overwhelming, you take one thing and then you're able to make steps from there. But the hardest thing is always getting started, because when you look at the big picture, it can be very overwhelming. And I know that's the situation with this. I'm looking at the bigger picture, I'm being terribly overwhelmed, and because of that, I just sent myself into a cascade of symptoms, even though I know better. Something that's been another hard thing to deal with is, as someone who is very much liking to be in control, and particularly liking to be able to control the way I handle my emotions, the way I conduct myself in general. Having medical conditions that mean that I'm not always as in control of the way I emotionally react to something. I actually had a point where when I was out of one of my mast cell medications, I would have uncontrollable crying jags that were actually pretty terrifying, because I couldn't stop. And they were like full on, gasping, sort of crying. And it wasn't because I was depressed. It wouldn't take much of a trigger at all. And I actually ended up getting off of that medication because we had trouble getting it consistently, just because none of the pharmacies in the area, I guess it's one that's not used a lot. It's cromolyn. You can see it in inhalers for allergies. I would take it in a liquid form 4 times a day. But the problem is that I was running into an issue where it was getting to the point where at least once a year, they would not be able to get a hold of it for me. Not just because it was expensive, but like no pharmacy could actually get a hold of it. So eventually I just like, you know what? I might as well go off of it, because another one of the things that happens with mast cell is that I've noticed that if I do a lot of this with my medications where I don't stay consistent, that can also make my body react adversely. So for me, not taking that medication is much better than going on and off of it. So it's just a lot better for my body to not have that medication at all, and then even if it seemed to have helped, and just work around it the best I can. And I have not, since I'm not having the issue where I'm going on that medication, off that medication, on that medication, off that medication, I've not had that extreme level of lack of emotional control that was so terrifying. But what else? I know that I'm missing other things. But yeah, I think one of the hardest things that I'm finding for these books in particular is I appreciate the science, and I think that they will be very good. Even if I don't end up feeling like I can follow things exactly, I can start implementing some of the things. But I think the most challenging thing, besides accessing different foods and making sure I have them available, it's first of all, working around the fact that I can't keep leftovers in the fridge. I need to be able to freeze them and then thaw them out and have them when I have leftovers, because when you have leftovers in the fridge, they build up in histamines. And actually, I did notice that if I made like a strawberry smoothie, it didn't have to be in the fridge very long before I would start getting a burning or nasty taste in my mouth from the strawberries. And that's because not only are strawberries high in histamine, but having them overnight for overnight oats would have that histamine build even higher. And it got to the point where I can't have strawberries anymore because they keep that taste for me. But so there's that, the fact that figuring out what food, the limiting of foods, the having to freeze foods versus just store them in the fridge like everybody else. And then the other issue for me is the fact that cooking times are challenging. I have very limited time outside my room, and a lot of times I don't want to, I'd rather spend that time, a little bit of time socializing with my family while they're awake than spend that time wiping myself out cooking. And so they also recommend as little processed foods as possible. So again, an extra challenge for somebody who doesn't have a lot of energy to spare anyway. So a bit overwhelmed by these books right now. I can't look at them any farther. I need to get to a mental space where I can handle them. But I do think that I'll have to take them one at a time, at least start off by just reading the science part, and then look into what I feel like I can or can't implement. But I thought that this would be a good moment to just show the parts of mast cell that can be challenging, that are a day-to-day, and that can vary from day to day. I don't necessarily know when I'm going to have a flare-up like this. Going into this week, I had no idea that this would be as rough of a week as it has been. And yeah, so a lot of times you have to learn to take things day by day and be very good about reading your body, because otherwise you're going to spend a lot of time and a lot of money going to the ER or to doctor's offices if you don't get to the point where you can kind of figure out what your normal is, particularly when you have something like mast cell, where most non-specialists that I have worked with do not know anything about mast cell activation syndrome. I am currently training my new PCP in basically all my medical conditions, because I haven't seen a PCP, gosh, it's got to be over 2 years, because a lot of times they get intimidated and they would rather not have to deal with me. And a lot of times I feel like I know what they're going to say anyway because of my own medical background in nursing, and I'd rather not spend money or energy I don't have leaving the house to just be told I don't know, or basically tell them what I think and then them go based off of what I think, which I could have done that from the comfort of my home and managed using what I have available to me. So really getting to the point where you know your body. Now, if you are someone who does not have a medical background, if you feel you need to see someone, don't necessarily do what I do. Nurses are the worst patients anyway. And I just have that as an added benefit to my chronic illnesses. It puts me in a position where maybe I can go a bit longer than the average person before I go in, because I have a pretty good idea of what I will be told. So I will try to implement whatever simple self-care, icing, for example, when I dislocated my knee with Ehlers-Danlos, probably could have gone in, but I ended up rest, ice, gosh, I'm trying to remember, it's been so long. Rest, ice, I think it's compress and elevate, basically splinting it. And so I did that, and it was painful, but they really weren't going to do anything different in the hospital. And so I took care of it myself. Would I advise that for everybody? No. But you have to get to the point where you know your body, you work with your medical provider about how often they want to see you, what you can feasibly handle at home. Like I said, I probably handle a lot more at home than the average person simply because I can. But I would not necessarily advise that for everybody. What else? I guess that's about it. I'm getting a bit chilled again, while also it's really weird feeling chilled and hot at the same time. But yeah, I don't know if I'll end up putting an introduction on this video or not, a whole introduction section on this video or not, with the music and all that. I kind of have a feeling not, although I really don't know that I want to look like this on my thumbnail picture, so maybe I'll at least do a little bit, because oh my gosh, that's kind of horrific. But there we go. Like I said, didn't intend to make a video today, but I thought that with Mast Cell Awareness Month coming to an end, and having gotten to Books for a Book Haul for that, this was as good of a time as any to do an end of month awareness. If anyone has questions about mast cell that were brought up by this video, or any other questions at all, I know that I'm a little bit fogged, I'm tired, my face feels swollen, so I'm probably missing things that I would normally want to have shared. So if you have questions down below, and you don't mind waiting a bit for a response, because sometimes I can take a while, please feel free to ask questions below. Thank you very much for joining me. Hope that you got something out of this video. I hope to do, before the end of June, my review on Red River. I hope to finish Baron and Luthien, but with the fact that I've had some swelling along the jaw, it has come down a bit with the lymph node swelling coming down here too. But when this was at its worst, it made some of the reading aloud for Baron Luthien uncomfortable. And with Baron Luthien, parts of it being in a lay, so like in a poem format, it just seemed that most appropriate to read it out loud, and I didn't want to lessen my experience with those parts of Baron Luthien by just reading it silently. So I hope to finish it by the end of June, but it all depends on how all this wraps up and how comfortable I'll feel reading the poetry aloud, because also sometimes a lot of talking can also take up energy. So anyway, thank you very much for joining me once again. I will close this because, yeah, God bless.